Hello, I am Red Mage, and welcome to a Magic the Gathering video featuring the color red. In today's video, we're reviewing new red cards from Murders at Karlov Manor. What we're going to do is discuss some of the more promising cards that could actually see play in standard decks. Starting off with two reprints, Lightning Helix and Shock. Lightning Helix is an extremely versatile and powerful card that could see play in a variety of decks. There's Boros Burn, Jeskai Control, and any kind of mid-range deck in between. It is efficient and it provides an incredible life swing. Shock can make a true burn deck possible, as well as contribute a redundant effect in addition to play with fire in mono red aggro. These are actually the two cards that I have my eyes on the most, that I am most interested in trying to build around. Burn is my favorite archetype after all, so of course I'm going to be trying various builds with both of these cards in it. Let's move on to talking about some new cards. The first new card we're going to talk about is Fugitive Codebreaker, a 2-mana 2/1 with prowess and haste. It also has Disguise, the new morph mechanic. You can cast a creature with Disguise face down for 3 mana as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2. When it is turned face up, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. So this is a classic red card advantage mechanic where you're discarding your hand and then drawing some cards when you meet some certain condition. The fact that it has prowess means that it benefits from being in a deck with a lot of instants and sorceries. Haste on a 2-mana 2-power creature is very good. 1 toughness is unfortunate, but it is also a goblin, and there is a lot of support for goblin synergies in this set. I think if we want to play a deck where we're maxing out on all the possible burn spells, this could be an inclusion. It also goes nicely with our next card. Pyrotechnic Performer is a payoff for playing disguised creatures. It's a 2-mana 3/2 with Disguise of 1 red mana. When it or another creature you control is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. You can essentially treat it as a 2-mana 3/2 with Kicker, that for 4 mana, you get a 3/2 that deals 3 damage to your opponent when it enters the battlefield. Note that these do stack. If you cast a Pyrotechnic Performer on turn 2, and then later you cast one face down and flip it up, you're going to get the trigger from the one you cast on turn 2, as well as the one that you just turned face up and deals 6 damage to your opponent. I could definitely see trying out a version of mono red aggro that focused on using Pyrotechnic Performer and Fugitive Codebreaker together. Next, with potential to see play in mono red, is Connecting the Dots. It's a 2-mana enchantment with, whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down, and you can pay 2 mana, discard your hand, and sacrifice it to put all the exiled cards into your hand. If you're able to cast a Connecting the Dots on turn 2 or 3, you have the chance to build up an enormous amount of cards. Notice that it says whenever a creature you control attacks, not whenever one or more creatures you control attack. So if you cast this on turn 3 and you've cast a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, and another 1-drop with haste on turn 3, you're going to exile 3 cards the turn that it comes into play. Of course, there's the downside of being a horrifically bad top deck, but it's definitely something that I'm going to look to try out. Next, Red Herring is a card that I'm really excited about, but I'm worried is just not going to be quite good enough. It's a 2-mana 2/2 artifact creature with haste. It attacks each combat if able, and it is a clue fish, so you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to draw a card. We already have an abundance of overwhelmingly powerful 2-drops for mono red in standard right now, so I don't know if this is going to find a home. But it is an incredibly good card. If it didn't have the drawback of attacking each combat if able, then I think this would be a slam dunk as the best 2-drop in mono red. I specifically like the play pattern of being able to attack with this into a bigger creature, and your opponent not being able to tell whether you're just going to sacrifice it to draw a card anyway, or you have a Monstrous Rage in your hand. I'm going to try at least one or two of these in mono red just to give it a shot. We'll see if it can compete with the other 2-drops, or cause this to be more 2-drop heavy and go down on either 1 or 3 drops. Next, Frantic Scapegoat. This is another creature that looks really good, but I could see being just not quite good enough compared to the really great cards that are already available in Standard. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with haste. When it enters the battlefield, you suspect it, which means that it has menace and can't block. Whenever one or more other creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if Frantic Scapegoat is suspected, you may suspect one of the other creatures. If you do, Frantic Scapegoat is no longer suspected. So, at its base, this is a 1-mana 1/1 haste menace. That is pretty good. As far as 1-mana 1/1s go, this preserves its value in the late game much more than most, being able to get around blockers to some extent. The problem is that the 1-drops that we have in Standard are so incredibly good that it is hard to see this making the cut. I could see myself maybe trying 1 or 2 copies at some point, but I'm not sure about that because it is just hard to see how it could be as good as a Phoenix Chick. And a Voldaren Epicure has a sort of pseudo haste anyway and comes with card selection. And obviously you wouldn't take out a Swift Spear or a Kamano. So I don't think it'll find a home, but there is some chance for it. And certainly when a rotation in Standard finally occurs, this could definitely be one of the anchors of a new mono red deck. Felonious Rage. This is not a card that I would consider for mono red aggro, I don't think. But this is something that I think could be really good for a Picnic Ruiner Cacophony Scamp deck. Gruul Pump Spell aggro type of deck. It gives +2/+0 and haste, which means that you could, on turn 3, cast a Picnic Ruiner, cast Felonious Rage on it, and get its trigger immediately. The biggest downside to Picnic Ruiner and Cacophony Scamp is that they don't have haste. This helps solve that while also giving the requisite pump to trigger Picnic Ruiner just on its own. We've got a couple of goblins that I think are very interesting. They're both goblin artifact synergy cards. First, Krenko, Baron of Tin Street, a 3-mana 3/3 with haste. That on its own is a great start for a goblin deck. It has the ability tap, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. Whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 red mana. If you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains haste until end of turn. This is an incredible ability. First of all, note that you are sacrificing an artifact as part of the activation cost of Krenko, so the +1/+1 counter trigger will be on the stack. That means the 1/1 that you make will get the +1/+1 counter on it as well. So the obvious first thought, since we have Onicult Anvil still in Standard, is that this could be in a Goblin Anvil deck. But I think you can even build a mono-red Goblin artifact deck that doesn't have Anvil in it, using things like Mishra's Research Desk and Candy Trail. Next, we have another 3-mana Goblin in Crime Novelist. It is a 1/3 with the ability, whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add 1 red mana. So obviously if you're sacrificing artifacts on the regular, as in an Anvil deck, this is just going to be something that triggers all the time naturally. But notice that Crime Novelist feeds Krenko's ability. It gives you the 1 red mana that you can use to make your 1/1 goblin token with Krenko. These are both 3-drops in either a goblin tribal deck or an anvil deck or a goblin anvil deck. 2 3-mana creatures being fit into the deck is a big ask, on top of all the other cards that you would normally want to play in such a deck. I'm definitely going to work on this and try and figure out how to make it work. We'll see. I think that the abilities of these 2 creatures are so insanely powerful that it's definitely worth trying. I think it's something that could be powerful enough to go over the top of other decks in a way that it would make the mana investment worth it. So we'll start with Boros for our gold cards, and first we have Agrus, Spirit of Justice. It's a 4-mana, 2/4, double strike, vigilance. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you choose up to 1 creature. If it's suspected, exile it, otherwise suspect it. You get to exile the first creature the first turn that it attacks. So if there's a larger creature on the battlefield, a Shieldred, for example, you get to exile that before they have a chance to block, which is a really big deal. The enter the battlefield trigger really means that this card is going to be able to get through a lot more often than it otherwise would. Next we have Aurelia, the Law Above, a 5-mana 4/4 flying vigilance haste. It has the abilities, whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, it deals 3 damage to each opponent and you gain 3 life. The 5 attacking creatures trigger is interesting. That's a reasonably okay defensive trigger in that you get to gain some life and possibly survive a big attack. But if you're attacking with 5 creatures already, dealing an extra 3 damage, while certainly going to be relevant sometimes, isn't necessarily that big of a deal. But on both offense and defense, drawing a card every time 3 or more creatures attack, that is a very big deal, and something you can easily achieve with a haste creature the turn that it enters the battlefield. Now, it is 5 mana, and we are talking about Boros aggro. That's the obvious home for this, although you could try it in some mid-range or control deck. It's powerful enough that you could try a copy or 2 at the top end of your curve. I think there's a really good chance that at the end of the day, 5 mana is just too much for the way that Boros decks are constructed right now, but the effect is so intensely powerful that it's worth giving it a shot. Finally, for Boros cards, we have Warleader's Call, a 3-mana enchantment with the abilities creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is the stapling of Glorious Anthem and Impact Tremors together, and that is an incredibly powerful combination. Both effects encourage you to really go wide, which is what the current Boros decks in Standard are already doing. I don't know how many copies of this you can play, because you don't want to dilute your creature game plan that would make these good in the first place. You would certainly always want one on the battlefield. It's just going to be a question of whether you can take a turn off to cast it. That being said, it does give you a lot more late game potential, being able to burn your opponent out without having to attack. Moving on to Gruul, we have Anzrag the Quake-Mole. 4-mana 8/4 Mole God. When Anzrag the Quake-Mole becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. You can also pay 7 mana to make your opponent block it. This is a very interesting card. Your opponent won't be able to survive very many turns chump blocking it, even if they have a lot of tokens, because you'll be able to attack multiple times each turn. But what I really want to do with Anzrag is Monstrous Rage and Callous Sellsword. It's bad enough to give your opponent another combat when you have to chump block their 8-power creature. But if it is instead an 11-power creature with trample, that's going to be basically unbeatable. I don't know if a 4-mana creature that doesn't have haste is going to fit very well into a Monstrous Rage deck, but I'm definitely going to give it a shot. Next we have Gleaming Geardrake. It's a 2-mana 1/1 artifact creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, which means to create a clue token. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is exactly the effect that you want for an Anvil deck. And so Grixis Anvil is going to be something that I'm going to have to try. Moving to Rakdos, we have the namesake of the guild, Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. A 6-mana 6/6 flying trample with the ability at the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So this is a 6-mana creature that does nothing when it enters the battlefield. But if your opponent does not have an instant speed removal spell that can take care of it, it is guaranteed to get at least a 3-for-1. You're getting a 2-for-0 at the end step, in that your opponent either sacrifices 2 things that are not lands or tokens, which is important, or you're going to draw 2 cards, and you've still got the Rakdos on the battlefield. That being said, it is 6 mana in a format that is relatively polarized between very fast decks and overwhelmingly powerful and or controlling decks. So it's hard to say if this is something that could find a home, but I could see this being something potentially interesting in a more mid-range Rakdos deck that doesn't maybe want to go all the way up to 7 mana for a Tali. That being said, are you going to play one of these before you play 4 Trumpeting Connoisseur? I'm not sure, but you could play 4 Trumpeting Connoisseur and one of these as exactly your top end. And finally, we have the card that I think I'm going to waste the largest amount of time trying to build decks around, Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. A 5-mana 3/4 with the ability, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink. Or create a 2/2 red imp creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Both of those things are incredibly powerful, but it is a 5-mana 3/4. So, could this be the top end of a burn deck? No, not a traditional one. You're not going to have any spells left to cast by the time you cast this. This has to be some kind of weird, mid-rangey, control-y spellslinger deck in Rakdos. I suppose you could play either Grixis or Mardu to go for a more control deck or include Lightning Helix. But the main thing that I want to pair with this is In the Festivities. Turning your 1-mana sorcery into a Plague Wind sounds good to me. Well, I hope you enjoyed talking about the possibilities for new red cards in Standard. Let me know in the comments what cards you're most excited to play with. I do want to mention before we go that this is the deck that I've been playing to rank up in Standard recently. It's the exact same deck list that I played in my last Mono Red video, which is linked in the description. I think that this build really balances the needs of the deck based on the metagame. It is fast, powerful, interactive, and consistent. And this is definitely what I'm going to continue to play to rank up in Standard until the new set comes out. I hope you enjoy building new decks for the new set. I know that I will, and I'll see you in the next one.